In the Second World War, the Allied air forces were losing bombers at an alarming rate. Engineers studied every aircraft that returned to base, mapped the bullet holes across the fuselage and wings, and proposed a logical solution: reinforce the most damaged areas. A statistician named Abraham Wald looked at the same data and told them they had it exactly backwards. The planes with bullet holes had survived. The data they actually needed, Wald explained, was on the planes that never came back. Wald's insight did not simply improve the design of aircraft. It exposed a flaw in human reasoning so deeply embedded that it operates almost invisibly, quietly shaping our judgments about success, risk, and wealth in ways most people never detect. We call it survivorship bias. And it may be the single most consequential cognitive error operating inside modern financial thinking. The mechanism is deceptively simple. We observe what survived. We draw conclusions from what is visible. What we cannot see, the failed businesses, the closed investment funds, the entrepreneurs who lost everything, the strategies that eventually collapsed, those data points simply vanish. They produce no memoirs. They do not appear at conferences. They do not build platforms with millions of followers. And so, without ever intending to, we construct our entire understanding of success from a dataset that is missing the majority of its relevant information. In the next 15 minutes, we are going to examine three things. The precise neurological mechanism that makes this bias so difficult to escape. What peer-reviewed research actually shows about how survivorship bias distorts financial decision-making. And a practical framework, grounded in evidence, for constructing a more accurate picture of reality. This is not an argument for pessimism. It is an argument for calibration. Consider a thought experiment. You are thinking about starting a business. Over the past year, you have read several books written by successful founders. You have watched interviews with entrepreneurs who built companies from nothing into significant enterprises. You have absorbed, in other words, a substantial amount of information about how businesses succeed. Now ask a different question. How many books have you read written by people who tried exactly the same thing and failed? How many interviews have you watched with entrepreneurs who spent 5 years, exhausted their savings, and eventually closed the doors with very little to show for it? For most people, the answer is very few. Perhaps none. And this is not because failure is rare. Research in this area consistently indicates that the majority of new ventures do not reach the outcomes their founders originally envisioned. The failure rate, across most categories of new enterprise, is substantial. But failure is largely invisible. It produces no platform. It generates no content. It leaves no published account of what went wrong and what those experiences felt like from the inside. The visible record, the books, the podcasts, the keynote addresses, the celebrated stories of improbable success, is populated almost exclusively by the people who survived. Here is the critical point. The advice contained in that visible record is not necessarily wrong. But it is drawn from a sample that is systematically skewed in one direction. The strategies praised by survivors may have been genuinely important factors in their success, or they may have been characteristics shared equally by the thousands of people who attempted the same thing and failed quietly and without documentation. Without the comparison group, without what researchers call the reference class, the full population of comparable attempts, it is statistically impossible to determine which. This is a concrete problem, not a philosophical one. The conclusions you draw about what works, what traits predict success, and which strategies are worth emulating are only as reliable as the completeness of the data you are drawing from. Wald understood this in 1943. The financial advice ecosystem, largely, continues to operate as though it does not apply. To understand why survivorship bias is so persistent, it helps to understand the cognitive mechanism that generates it. In 1973, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman introduced a concept they called the availability heuristic. Their research demonstrated that people tend to overestimate the importance or likelihood of information that is readily available to them, rather than drawing on a more diverse and representative range of evidence. When we judge how likely something is, how often businesses succeed, how frequently a particular strategy works, how common a given outcome is, we draw on examples that come to mind easily. And some examples come to mind far more easily than others. Survivors are disproportionately easy to recall. They are present. They are visible. They have produced the kind of vivid, memorable narratives that lodge in memory and get repeated across different contexts. Failures, by contrast, disappear. They leave no memorable examples, no quotable lessons, no story worth retelling at an industry conference. Tversky and Kahneman's work suggests this is not a flaw found only in unsophisticated thinkers. It is a feature of how the brain manages uncertainty. When we cannot access comprehensive data, and we almost never can, the mind substitutes a simpler question: how easily can I call an example to mind? That substitution is automatic, rapid, and largely invisible to conscious inspection. Kahneman, writing in his 2011 book Thinking, Fast and Slow, described how these cognitive biases interact with conditions of high cognitive load and time pressure, making systematic errors in judgment more likely precisely in the situations where accuracy matters most. The structural problem, then, is this. The information most readily available to us, the success stories, the survivor narratives, the self-made millionaires whose methods have been documented and packaged and sold, is exactly the information most likely to produce distorted judgments. And the information we most need, the full distribution of outcomes, the base rate, the comparison group, is exactly the information our intuition has the least access to. The most carefully documented case study in survivorship bias comes from the mutual fund industry. The findings are worth examining with some precision. In 1995, researchers Stephen Brown, William Getzmann, and Stephen Ross published a study examining how survivorship bias affects the evaluation of fund performance. Their research found that investors and analysts consistently focus on funds that have survived, the ones still operating, still publishing returns, while systematically ignoring the performance of funds that have failed or been quietly merged out of existence. This matters because the funds that close are not a random sample of all funds. They are disproportionately the ones that performed poorly. When those funds are removed from the dataset, the average performance of the remaining pool looks considerably better than it would across the full, unfiltered population. A subsequent study by Carhart, Carpenter, and Lynch in 2002 confirmed this effect, finding that survivorship bias can produce significantly higher estimates of average investment returns, precisely because failed funds are routinely excluded from performance calculations. Think through the practical implication. If you are evaluating whether to invest in a category of funds based on publicly available historical performance data, you may be examining a dataset from which the worst performers have already been silently removed. The track record you are reviewing is not the track record of the strategy as a whole. It is the track record of the strategy among the instances that happen to survive long enough to remain in the data. Research by McElroy and Morrow in 2010 found this bias is more pronounced in situations where the selection process is not transparent, where it is difficult or impossible to account for the missing observations. In most contexts where retail investors access fund performance information, that description fits almost exactly. You are not evaluating a strategy. You are evaluating the strategy's survivors. The standard response to survivorship bias in popular financial media is to acknowledge it, briefly, and then proceed as if the acknowledgement were sufficient. Note the caveat. Carry on studying the survivors. This misunderstands the depth of the problem. Conventional financial wisdom is built almost entirely on case studies drawn from successful outcomes. It analyses the companies that grew, the investors who compounded fortunes, the strategies that generated exceptional returns over extended periods. The implicit assumption underlying all of this is that these cases are genuinely informative, that by studying what worked, we can extract replicable principles. Kahneman and Tversky's work on how people make decisions under uncertainty helps explain why this assumption is so durable and so seductive. Their research established that people tend to be loss-averse, weighting the prospect of losses more heavily than equivalent gains. Survivor narratives are compelling partly because they are stories of gains achieved and catastrophe avoided. They engage exactly the parts of our decision-making architecture that are most susceptible to motivated reasoning. But the deeper problem lies in what these narratives structurally cannot tell us. The characteristics associated with successful investors and entrepreneurs, persistence, contrarian thinking, high risk tolerance, long time horizons, may indeed be genuinely predictive. Or they may be present in equal measure among the vast, invisible population of people who attempted comparable things and failed without record. Without access to both groups, that question cannot be answered. And yet the financial advice industry answers it with remarkable confidence, every single day, based on a sample that by definition excludes the most informative comparison group available. So what does a more evidence-grounded approach look like in practice? Researchers Philip Tetlock and Dan Gardner, in their work on improving forecasting and decision-making under uncertainty, described the importance of actively considering alternative perspectives, deliberately seeking out information that challenges the most available narrative, rather than defaulting to it. Applied to survivorship bias, this generates a three-part framework. First, identify the reference class before drawing any conclusions. Before extracting lessons from a success story, ask, what is the full population of people or organizations that attempted something comparable? What happened to the ones who failed? If that information is genuinely unavailable or opaque, the case study should be treated as anecdote rather than evidence. Second, search for the counterexample. For any strategy, characteristic, or behavior celebrated in a survivor narrative, actively look for examples of people who possessed that same quality and still failed. This is not pessimism. It is the basic statistical requirement for establishing whether an association is meaningful or merely coincidental, whether the quality predicts success or simply accompanies attempts. Third, anchor to the base rate. Before revising your beliefs based on a compelling individual story, ask what the baseline distribution of outcomes looks like for this type of endeavor. Research in this area consistently finds that individual narratives are weighted too heavily in judgment, and base rates too lightly, precisely because narratives are vivid and memorable while statistical distributions are neither. None of this eliminates uncertainty. Nothing does. But it replaces a systematically distorted picture with a more complete one. It is, in essence, the same correction Wald made in 1943, asking not what the visible data shows, but what the complete data would show. Abraham Wald's insight carries one final implication worth sitting with. The engineers who proposed reinforcing the bullet-scarred sections of the bomber were not reasoning carelessly. They were doing exactly what the human brain is built to do, drawing conclusions from available information. The error was not in their reasoning process. The error was in their unexamined assumption that the available information was representative of the full picture. The financial advice you have encountered across your lifetime is, in large part, built on exactly that assumption. That the visible record, the survivors, the success stories, the strategies that happen to work, is representative of the full distribution of possible outcomes. It almost never is. This does not mean that success is unlikely, or that skill and judgment and effort are irrelevant. What it means is that the map most people are using to navigate financial decisions has been drawn almost entirely from territories that were explored successfully. The territories that swallowed people whole are simply blank. No one came back from them to file a report. Building a more accurate map requires deliberately seeking out what is not visible. The funds that closed. The businesses that failed in silence. The strategies that looked identical to successful ones until they didn't. The planes that never came back. Wald's analysis was eventually adopted. Engineers redesigned the aircraft based on what was absent from the returning planes, not what was present on them. Survival rates improved measurably. The evidence, when correctly gathered and correctly interpreted, changed the outcome. The same principle is available to anyone willing to ask the harder question about what the data is not showing them.